In 1936, a king lost his throne because the woman he loved had been divorced. The church wouldn't allow it. Parliament wouldn't allow it. The entire British establishment said, unthinkable. And then, in 2005, Charles married Camilla, a divorcee, and no one lost a thing. That gap, 69 years between exile and acceptance, between punishment and permission, tells you everything about how the British monarchy actually works. The rules on marriage and divorce were never sacred principles. They were political levers, pulled when convenient, ignored when inconvenient. And the receipts go back 500 years. The foundation of this contradiction dates to 1534. Henry VIII had petitioned Pope Clement VII to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a wife who couldn't give him a son, and in the dynastic calculus of Tudor England, that failure was existential. Clement refused the annulment. Henry's response wasn't theological. It was structural. He broke England away from the Roman Catholic Church entirely, pushed the Act of Supremacy through Parliament in 1534, and installed himself as supreme governor of a brand new institution, the Church of England. Henry married Anne Boleyn. The entire Anglican faith exists because a king wanted a divorce. Henry didn't stop at one marriage. He married 6 times. He had Anne Boleyn beheaded in 1536. He had Catherine Howard beheaded in 1542. 2 wives executed, 2 wives divorced, 1 dead in childbirth, 1 who simply outlived him. The Church of England was built so the crown could do whatever it needed to do about marriage. Every moral pronouncement that church would make over the next 4 centuries about the sanctity of marriage, every solemn declaration about the impermissibility of divorce, all of it rests on an institution that is itself a monument to the opposite principle. A church founded on divorce would one day destroy a king for attempting the same act. The irony isn't subtle, it's architectural. For centuries, that contradiction stayed dormant. No monarch was foolish enough or brave enough to force the question again. Then came Edward. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, his family called him David, was by the early 1930s the most glamorous royal figure in the world. He'd served during the First World War, though kept from the front lines to his frustration, toured the empire with movie star charisma, and cultivated an image of rakish modernity that made the stuffier elements of the court deeply uncomfortable. Slim, boyish, restless, and increasingly drawn to a woman named Bessie Wallis Warfield, born in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, in 1896. She'd already married and divorced a U.S. Navy aviator named Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., and was currently married to her second husband, Ernest Simpson, an Anglo-American businessman. By 1934, Edward was infatuated. By 1935, the relationship was an open secret among the British ruling class, though the British press, bound by a gentleman's agreement with Downing Street, kept it out of the newspapers entirely, while American and European papers blazed with photographs and speculation. Wallis herself would later describe the archaic snobbery she encountered when living in London, writing that, "The British seem to cherish a sentiment of settled disapproval towards things American. What was coming would transcend snobbery entirely. Edward was heir to the throne, and as king, he would become supreme governor of the Church of England, the same church that in the 1930s held an absolute prohibition on the remarriage of divorced persons whose former spouses were still living. Wallis Simpson was divorced once and divorcing again. Her first husband, Earl Winfield Spencer, was still alive. The church's position admitted no ambiguity, and behind that doctrinal wall stood the full force of the British establishment. The Prime Minister, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Dominion governments, and a parliament that viewed the monarchy's moral authority as inseparable from its political utility. George V died on January 20th, 1936, and Edward ascended as King Edward VIII. The crisis that had been simmering in Whitehall corridors now had an expiration date. That autumn, Edward formally told Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin he intended to marry Wallis, whose divorce from Ernest Simpson was being finalized in the courts at Ipswich. Baldwin moved with the careful, deliberate precision of a man who understood that a constitutional crisis could also be a political opportunity. He consulted with the governments of the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and reported back that they too found the marriage unacceptable for the head of the Commonwealth. Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, was implacably opposed on doctrinal grounds. Edward floated the idea of a morganatic marriage, where Wallis would become his wife but not his queen, a compromise that had precedent in European monarchies but no footing in British constitutional law. Baldwin rejected it after consulting cabinet and the Dominion prime ministers. The corridors of Whitehall offered no third option: give up Wallis or give up the throne. Parliament passed the His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act on December 10, 1936. The following evening, Edward addressed the nation by radio from Windsor Castle and delivered the line that would calcify into legend. He couldn't carry on the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved. Clean, romantic, a king who sacrificed everything for love. That story has survived nearly 9 decades, embedded in popular culture so deeply that one biographer observed it has been told so many times that it has taken on the character of a fairy tale. Like fairy tales, much of it requires interrogation. The romantic narrative served the establishment beautifully for decades. It recast a political purge as a love story, and the evidence that has emerged since, from captured German archives, declassified intelligence files, wartime testimony, tells a different and far darker story about why the British government was so eager to let its king walk away. Edward's sympathies were the real problem. Throughout the 1930s, before and during his brief reign, he expressed admiration for elements of the Nazi project that went well beyond the fashionable flirtation with fascism found in certain corners of the British upper class. He made remarks sympathetic to Hitler's domestic program. He displayed casual disregard for constitutional conventions that alarmed the entire civil service apparatus. State papers in red boxes were left unread. Sensitive documents left lying about in unsecured settings where Wallis and her social circle had access to them. Baldwin and his advisors were receiving intelligence reports about Edward's political attitudes, even as the marriage crisis was building. Those reports painted a picture of a man whose loyalties were, at minimum, ambiguous, and at worst, compromised. The establishment had a king problem that went far beyond which woman he wanted to marry. Baldwin understood this with a politician's instinct for leverage. The divorce question was public, photogenic, easy to explain to a population that trusted the church. Edward's political sympathies were none of those things. They were murky, potentially treasonous, and impossible to air without inflicting catastrophic damage on the very institution the government was trying to protect. The marriage crisis handed Baldwin a mechanism that was constitutionally sound, publicly comprehensible, and, crucially, sympathetic to Edward himself. A king who abdicated for love could retain some dignity. A king removed because his government feared he was a security risk would have destroyed public confidence in the monarchy for a generation. Baldwin chose the exit that protected the institution. The church's prohibition on divorced queens was the instrument. The cause lay elsewhere. After the abdication, the evidence mounted with alarming speed. In October 1937, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor embarked on a visit to Nazi Germany that sent shockwaves through the British Foreign Office. They toured factories and housing projects under the direction of Robert Ley, the head of the German Labor Front. Edward was photographed appearing to give the Nazi salute, images that German propaganda outlets ran as a tacit endorsement of the regime by a former British king. The trip culminated in a private audience with Adolf Hitler at the Berghof, his mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps above Berchtesgaden. The meeting room, with its enormous picture window overlooking the Untersberg Massif, was the stage Hitler reserved for dignitaries he wished to impress. The Windsors were treated with full protocol, a reception that went far beyond courtesy and signaled, to anyone paying attention, that Germany regarded the Duke as an asset worth cultivating. The social circle surrounding the Windsors in these years tells its own story. Figures like Sir Oswald Mosley, founder of the British Union of Fascists, moved in the same orbit. Wallis herself had alleged connections to Joachim von Ribbentrop, Germany's ambassador to London and later its foreign minister. British intelligence services were watching all of it, cataloging contacts, intercepting correspondence, building a file that grew thicker by the month. The most explosive material emerged after Germany's defeat. Allied troops advancing through Hesse in 1945 discovered a cache of German Foreign Ministry documents at Marburg Castle, the Marburg Files, that detailed the extent of Nazi interest in Edward as an instrument of German policy. Among those documents was the outline of Operation Willy, a German intelligence operation conceived in the summer of 1940 when the Windsors were stranded in neutral Portugal following the fall of France. The timing was critical. France had fallen, Britain stood alone, and in neutral Portugal, the former King of England was stranded. Ribbentrop directed the plan himself. German agents were to lure Edward into Spanish or German-controlled territory through a combination of flattery, bribery, and veiled threats. The ultimate objective was breathtaking in its ambition. Hold Edward in reserve as a puppet king who could be installed on the British throne in the event of a successful invasion or a negotiated peace. German agents approached intermediaries in the Windsors' circle. Messages were passed. The Spanish government was drawn into the scheme. Churchill moved decisively. He dispatched a warship to extract the Windsors and packed Edward off to the Bahamas as governor, a post chosen precisely because it sat thousands of miles from the European theater and the German agents who circled him. The Bahamas appointment was, in everything but name, an exile within exile. Edward would spend the war years governing a colonial backwater while his brother endured the Blitz. Operation Willy collapsed with the Windsors' departure, but the mere fact of its existence proved something the British government had feared since before the abdication. The Nazi leadership believed, based on their own intelligence and their own direct interactions with Edward, that the former king was sympathetic enough to justify an elaborate multinational covert operation. MI5 maintained surveillance on the Windsors throughout the war years, even in Nassau. Churchill personally intervened to ensure that the Marburg files remained classified after the war, understanding their publication would devastate the monarchy's credibility and raise questions about the abdication that Whitehall had no appetite to answer. The files were eventually released decades later, and their contents confirmed what the intelligence community had long known. Edward's removal from the throne in 1936 had solved a problem far larger than a marriage to a divorcee. The establishment had used the divorce question, legitimate, constitutional, publicly comprehensible, as the mechanism to remove a king whose political sympathies represented an existential security threat to the nation. When Edward boarded HMS Fury on the night of December 11, 1936, and sailed into exile across the English Channel, the crown didn't evaporate. It landed, with all its weight, all its obligation, all its crushing public exposure, on the head of his younger brother, Albert, known to the family as Bertie. And Bertie had been systematically broken by the very family he was now expected to represent. George V, his father, was a rigid, emotionally glacial man who believed children should be afraid of their fathers, and reportedly said as much, governing his household with a naval officer's discipline that left no space for warmth or reassurance. Bertie's nanny, the person entrusted with his earliest and most formative care, physically abused him. She would pinch him and withhold food before presenting him to his parents at the appointed hour, creating a cycle of pain that preceded every parental encounter, and this abuse continued for years before it was discovered and she was dismissed. His mother, Queen Mary, embodied a generational philosophy of aristocratic emotional distance that amounted, in practice, to abandonment. She deferred to her husband's harshness and offered her children formality where they needed comfort. Bertie developed a severe stammer, widely understood by modern psychologists as a psychosomatic response to chronic childhood trauma. He suffered from knock-knees, treated with agonizing corrective splints strapped to his legs at night. He was the spare, the stuttering, anxious second son who had never been groomed for the throne, never wanted it, and whose entire upbringing had reinforced the message that he was lesser than his golden older brother. Then Edward left, and the full weight of the British crown dropped onto that man. Bertie's coronation in May 1937, inside Westminster Abbey, was an ordeal endured rather than a triumph celebrated. A king must speak, must broadcast to the nation and the empire, must project confidence to a public that needed reassurance in an era of rising continental fascism. Every public address Bertie delivered carried the risk of visible, audible humiliation before millions of listeners. Every radio broadcast was an act of endurance. He bore that weight through the Blitz, through the bombing of Buckingham Palace itself, through 6 years of total war that aged him visibly and broke his health, through the grinding demands of a post-war reign that gave him no respite. He died of lung cancer on February 6, 1952, at the age of 56. Edward, comfortable in his Paris exile in a grand house near the Bois de Boulogne, lived to 77. The man who ran outlived the man who stayed by 2 decades. Edward and Wallis spent those decades in gilded isolation. Wallis was denied the title of Her Royal Highness, a snub Edward felt as a wound until his death. He'd believed the exile would be temporary, that the family would soften, that Wallis would eventually be accepted. None of it materialized. The royal family maintained its distance with the kind of polite, immovable coldness at which the British establishment excels. They entertained lavishly, traveled widely, and were fixtures of international café society. But the surface papered over emptiness, a former king without a country, and a wife his family refused to acknowledge. When Edward died in 1972, he was buried at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle, returned in death to the institution that expelled him in life. Wallis survived him by 14 years, increasingly reclusive, eventually incapacitated, dying in 1986. The royal family's sustained shunning of Wallis cemented the Church's prohibition on remarriage as an unbreakable law, a principle so absolute that a king had been exiled over it, a brother's life broken by its enforcement, and a woman denied even the basic dignity of her husband's family title. That prohibition held for decades. It appeared permanent. And then a man named Charles fell in love with a woman named Camilla in the early 1970s, and everything the Crown had claimed about the sacred inviolability of its marriage rules was slowly, methodically, quietly dismantled. Charles and Camilla met in 1971 at a polo match in Windsor Great Park and began a relationship. Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, a cavalry officer, in 1973. Charles married Lady Diana Spencer in July 1981 in a ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral, watched by 750 million people worldwide. The wedding was framed as a fairy tale for a global television audience hungry for pageantry. She walked up the aisle toward a man who was already in love with someone else. Charles continued his relationship with Camilla throughout both marriages, his to Diana, Camilla's to Parker Bowles, a fact that became public knowledge in stages, each more damaging than the last. In 1989, the secrecy collapsed. An intercepted phone call between Charles and Camilla, the so-called Camillagate tape, was recorded by an amateur radio enthusiast and leaked to the press. The transcript was explicit, intimate, and humiliating in granular detail. Millions of people read the future king's private words to his married lover. The scandal didn't destroy Charles's position as heir. It couldn't. The line of succession isn't subject to public opinion polls, but it shattered whatever remained of the fairy tale marriage, and it confirmed what Diana had known for years. Diana didn't stay silent. On November 20th, 1995, she sat for an interview with Martin Bashir on BBC's Panorama and delivered the line that crystallized a decade of betrayal. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. 23 million people in Britain alone watched her say it. The interview was devastating, composed, direct, and delivered with the kind of controlled precision that made it impossible to dismiss as bitterness. She named the affair. She put the institution on trial in front of its own public. Charles and Diana divorced in 1996 after 15 years of marriage. Diana was killed in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris on August 31, 1997. The public grief was oceanic. Camilla was the most hated woman in Britain. What happened next was one of the longest, most carefully managed public rehabilitation campaigns in modern British history. Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman a majority of the British public held responsible for destroying Diana's marriage, needed to become an acceptable consort for the future king. The transformation was engineered with corporate precision. Camilla began appearing at carefully staged public events alongside Charles, initially at a distance, then closer. Sympathetic profiles materialized in broadsheets and Sunday supplements. She was presented as warm, unassuming, good-humored, the antithesis of the calculating villainess the tabloids had built. Charitable patronages accumulated. Public appearances multiplied. Year after year, the image-makers worked, softening the edges of a figure who had been, for millions of people, the most hated woman in Britain. The Church of England's doctrinal position bent in tandem with this PR operation, and the timing is the most revealing detail in this entire story. In 1936, the prohibition on remarriage of divorcees had been treated as immovable granite, a constitutional bedrock so fundamental that a king had to be removed rather than permit the slightest crack. By 2002, the General Synod issued new guidance allowing clergy discretion on the remarriage of divorced persons, a theological pivot that arrived 3 years before the heir to the throne needed exactly that accommodation. The doctrine didn't evolve because some theologian discovered a new reading of Scripture on a quiet afternoon in a Cambridge college. It evolved because the institution needed it to evolve, and the institution's needs had a name and a wedding date. On April 9, 2005, Charles and Camilla married in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, not in a church. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, blessed the union afterward at St. George's Chapel, but he didn't perform the ceremony itself. Even in 2005, the old rules still technically existed. They were simply worked around rather than enforced. A workaround that the church dressed in the language of pastoral sensitivity, but that functioned in practice as institutional accommodation for the man who would one day become its supreme governor. The church hadn't changed its mind about divorce. It had changed its priorities. Camilla took the title Duchess of Cornwall rather than Princess of Wales, a concession to public sensitivity about Diana that cost the institution nothing of substance. The heir to the throne married a divorcee, maintained his position, kept his titles, kept his income, kept his place in the line of succession, and suffered no consequences whatsoever. Edward had lost his crown, his country, his family, and his purpose for the same act. Charles lost nothing. Cheating is tradition, apparently, and so is the selective enforcement of the rules that supposedly prohibit it. In 1936, the establishment needed Edward gone, and the Church's prohibition on divorcees was the lever that removed him. In 2005, the establishment needed Charles to succeed Elizabeth, and that same prohibition was quietly shelved. The doctrine moved in whichever direction the political wind was blowing, both times. Then came May 6, 2023, Westminster Abbey. The same abbey where Bertie had endured his reluctant coronation 86 years earlier. Camilla was crowned alongside Charles III. Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby presided as she was anointed with holy oil behind a screen, the most sacred element of the coronation liturgy. Her title, initially Duchess of Cornwall, had been quietly upgraded. A divorcee, anointed with holy oil in Westminster Abbey, crowned with full pageantry and ecclesiastical solemnity by the same Church of England that had declared a divorcee beside the throne unthinkable within living memory. Place the two images side by side. December 1936. A king standing before a microphone at Windsor Castle, telling his people he must leave because the woman he loves has been divorced, and the Church and the Constitution won't bend. May 2023. A divorcee anointed with holy oil behind a screen in Westminster Abbey by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Same institution, same abbey, same church, same anointing ritual, different political need, different outcome. In 1936, removing Edward solved a security problem. In 2023, crowning Camilla ensured institutional continuity. The rules flexed to match the need, both times. Every claim of sacred tradition, every invocation of moral authority, every solemn ecclesiastical pronouncement about the sanctity of marriage, all of it bends to the same force. What the crown needs to survive in that particular moment. And the pattern didn't end at the coronation. In January 2020, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle announced they were stepping back from senior royal duties. By early 2021, they'd relocated to California, sat for a bombshell interview with Oprah Winfrey, and had their royal patronages stripped. A prince choosing a partner the establishment disapproved of. Media vilification directed overwhelmingly at the woman. Exile abroad. France swapped for California. The structural echoes of Edward and Wallis are so precise they feel rehearsed. Meghan's race added a dimension Wallis never faced, but the institutional playbook grinding against an unwelcome partner operated on the same principles, running the same patterns 84 years later. 500 years of receipts. Henry VIII founded a church so he could divorce. That church expelled a king for wanting to marry a divorcee, or rather, use the divorce as cover for expelling a king whose real offenses were far more dangerous. And that king's great-nephew married a divorcee anyway, then was crowned in the same abbey, anointed by the same church, seated on the same throne. The rules didn't change because a principle was re-examined. They changed because the institution needed them to. If tradition is so important, then why is Charles king? Subscribe for more stories like this.